All right, in this video, we'll begin the evolution unit, and we'll begin by talking about um, Darwin, and more so, not necessarily Darwin in this video, but we'll be talking about the people that kind of led up to Darwin and some of his conclusions. In the next video, we'll look more at Darwin's ideas concerning natural selection. But we will spend a little bit of time talking about Darwin in this video. Darwin is known for his theory of natural selection. He published a book about it called On the Origin of Species in 1859. Again, date's not important, but that's just kind of placing it in history. And the book deals with a lot of themes. It deals with biodiversity on Earth and kind of Darwin took a trip around the world, so he got to see a lot of the different types of organisms. And so he looked at how those species were distributed across different types of geography and different types of terrain, and how they were specifically suited for their environment. And he was able to compare species that live in the desert in one continent, species that live in the desert on another continent. You get the idea. And he began to see similarities in those species and thought, obviously, these things aren't getting on boats and traveling, so there has to be something else going on here. They are adapted to their environment. Well, how did they get that way? And that's his idea, is that they changed or evolved through the process of natural selection. Now, a couple of people that Darwin uh, are contributed to Darwin's work, and what I mean by that is that it influenced him. They read he read their work and understood their work, and so we'll list them off. This guy, Carolus Linnaeus, he is known as the father of taxonomy. Taxonomy is just the idea of grouping species together. He came up with this particular way that we still name creatures today, called binomial nomenclature, which is just assigning two names to each creature. Uh, the like Homo sapiens is our species name, or and so the Homo and in that one is the genus, and the sapiens is the species. And so a lot of, well, all animals and plants on Earth, we give, and all other living things for that matter, we give two names to them: a genus name and then a species name. And the genus is always capitalized, species is always lowercase, and they're both in italics. And this is something that you've seen before. So this is classification system. Linnaeus didn't have anything this complicated, so this is something that has changed over the years. In Linnaeus's original classification, there were only two kingdoms. There were plants and animals, and so we have since broadened that quite a bit. And then there's even a group called domains. Domains are really big, like eukarya on here. That's all eukaryotes. So basically anything that's not a bacteria fits in that group. And then the next thing is kingdoms, and this is like animals or plants or bacteria, two types of bacteria. There's like protists, there's fungi, and so then you have the phyla, and phyla is where, so if you have animals like you see here, then you have phyla, and the phyla is like, all chordates, for instance, that's chordata, or all of segmented worms, or all jellyfish, or something like that. You get the idea. Still a big group. And then class is going to be even more specific, and then you order, family, genus, and then species is where you get to an individual animal, or certain type of animal. The next guy that we'll look at is Georges Cuvier. Cuvier was French. He was a famous paleontologist, and paleontologists, of course, study old things like fossils. And he noticed that fossils were found in, here's some fossils, different kinds of fossils. Normally we associate fossils with like bones, but any kind of remnant of the past, in ancient past, would be considered a fossil. There you have like the anything trapped in the amber or the fossilized tree or the leaves there, all considered fossils. And so what Cuvier noticed is that these fossils will be found in sediment and rocks, in the layers of rocks, and these layers would have to be built over time, and this was a gradual kind of process. But what Cuvier said is that actually what's going on is you would notice at certain levels there would be this a vast amount of creatures that would be dead at certain levels. And so he theorized that what led to these sudden disappearances were these big catastrophes. And so he had this theory of catastrophism. And again, it's the theory that it tries to explain why organisms seem to suddenly disappear from the existence of the earth, like these large extinction events, like dinosaurs, for instance. Some large catastrophic event had to occur in order to cause this to happen. This guy is James Hutton. And Hutton is a geologist. A geologist is someone who studies rocks and the Earth's processes. And he proposed a theory of gradualism. And Hutton was a Scottish geologist, and he was looking around at some of the Scottish countryside. And you can see here, this is the picture above is actually one of his drawings, and the picture below shows, where he probably found this from, the actual location. And you can see the layers in the soil. You can see the horizontal sedimentation. There's these vertical uh, rocks as well that are, different layers are bent and so forth. And what he said is that in order for these sorts of processes to occur, the Earth has to be very old. Mountains and canyons, these things don't form over short periods of time. They form over really long periods of time. And this was significant because the majority of the world thought the Earth to be fairly young, using the biblical narrative. And Hutton said, nope, that can't be true. The Earth is not thousands of years old. The Earth has to be millions of years old. And so this, for you think of in Darwin's terms, Darwin thought for his processes to happen, there has to be a very long time. So Darwin would have read Hutton and said, yeah, that's absolutely has to be the truth. And the same thing's going to occur with this guy, Charles Lyell, whose picture got a little bit stretched out. He doesn't probably look like that for real. He came up with this theory called Uniformitarianism. And he was also a geologist. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology. This is a book that Darwin took with him on his voyage around the world, and I'm sure it was exhilarating to read. But this theory of uniformitarianism, the whole idea is, and his phrase was, the key to the past is the present. So you can look at how things are occurring today. And so this is a picture from his book, actually, and has this mountain, and he talked about how rocks will weather. And so you can see this today. You can go out and watch a mountain of dirt or a hill of dirt, and if it gets rained on in the wind and so forth, that dirt is going to shrink over time. Well, multiply that times 100, where you have these giant mountains. They're also going to wear out over time. This is happening today, but it's always been happening. And so you take mountains like the Rockies, which are these tall mountains that look very sharp and rigid, and then you go to mountains like the Appalachians, which are rounded. And so he says, look, obviously the Earth is aging, and mountains don't become rounded in a few weeks. It takes a long time. And so Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism also said, hey, the Earth has to be very old and for these processes to occur. The next person that Darwin read was a guy by the name of Lamarck. And just as a contrast, Darwin and Lamarck didn't agree with one another. Now, they weren't necessarily contemporaries, they weren't at the same time, but they were. Darwin did read his books and said, nope, this isn't how this works. And so Lamarck's theory was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So there's a few things here. Acquired characteristics is basically the idea that a species can acquire certain characteristics over the course of their lifetime, and that their offspring will inherit those acquired characteristics. And so he used a giraffe to talk about this, and he said that a giraffe has a inner need for perfection. And so what that giraffe does is it's sitting out on the prairie with a short neck, and it sees that there are leaves up higher, and so that giraffe will actually stretch its neck in order to reach those leaves. And upon stretching more and more, the giraffe will finally have a longer neck that it needs to reach those leaves. And then the key here is that the giraffe is then able to pass that trait on to the next generation, thus the offspring of the giraffe inheriting that perfection that the previous generation gathered. And so, oddly enough, this happens to be the average person's theory on evolution, and they will word it something like this. They won't be as silly as the giraffe, but they'll say, well, there was a problem, the animals needed to adapt to it, and they did, and therefore they changed. That is the animal's desires are not what drives evolution. What drives evolution is actually the death of those animals that are not fit. Only the fit survive, and therefore those fit traits are what get passed on. It's not an animal's desire. We are attributing, when we say things like that, we attribute things to animals that they don't have. And so it has nothing to do with the animal's need. And so on the other side, he would also say that if an animal stopped using something, that it would eventually lose that. So he had this idea of use and disuse as well, that if an animal was able to use something, it would get better. If it didn't use it, it would get worse, or it would just go away. You think of whales, the idea that whales used to have legs. Well, Lamarck would say they don't have legs anymore because they stopped using them. And that's not the case. Darwin would say they don't have any legs anymore because those animals that had hind legs were less fit than the ones that didn't. And so there's a big difference there. One of the things that AP graders look for in particular when it comes to writing concerning evolution is, does the student understand the difference between Lamarck and Darwin and those two theories? Because a lot of times what we say ends up sounding more Lamarckian than what we realize. And lastly is this guy named Thomas Malthus. He was an economist in Great Britain, and he lived in London. He wrote an essay called Principles of Population. Darwin also took this stunner with him on his trip. And the book basically states that more organisms are produced in nature than can survive. He looked at the crowded streets of London in his day when London was probably the largest city on earth, and it was crowded, and he looked around and he said, you know what? All of these people can't survive. The only ones that are going to survive are the wealthy, and because they have the means. And so Malthus came up with a couple of ideas with that. Basically, that populations will increase, but they will only increase as there are resources available, and that resource line produces this struggle for existence. And with that struggle, those who are most fit are going to be the ones that survived. And so you've probably heard the term survival of the fittest. This actually wasn't a Darwinian term. This was coined by a psychologist that had to do with these same kind of ideas. And this has been used to promote lots of bad things over the course of history, thinking like something like social Darwinism and eugenics, which is basically killing off genetically inferior individuals because of different kinds of reasons. And so we have to be careful how you apply these kinds of things, obviously, because with people, there's a lot more things going on with just with animals. But Malthus's hypothesis goes all the, for the people in the streets of London, but it also goes for the deer that are out in the woods trying to survive. If there's a limited resource, or if there's predators, for instance, and those predators are chasing the deer, only the deer that are able to evade the predators are going to live, and that furthers that species along by the faster deer survive, then those fast deer reproduce, and so forth.